An unexpected entrance and the scornful gaze. The Jefferson County Courthouse on that rainy Tuesday morning was, in essence, a monument to the mundane. Wood-paneled walls bore the scuffs of countless hurried feet, the linoleum floors gleamed with a dull, worn sheen, and the air hung heavy with the faint, persistent scent of old coffee and forgotten paper. It was the kind of place where stories were typically buried beneath bureaucratic noise, swallowed whole by the tedium of routine justice. But on this particular day, something profoundly different walked in. He didn't shuffle or slouch, didn't betray the defeated posture so common among those led to the defendant's table. Instead, he moved with an unshakable purpose, his back ramrod straight, eyes fixed forward, a quiet defiance in every line of his lean, controlled frame. His sharp, charcoal-grey suit bore no wrinkles, his clean shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the muted courtroom lights. He appeared to be in his early 50s, perhaps 52, his salt and pepper beard trimmed meticulously close, framing a face that held no hint of plea or anxiety. He wasn't a man trying to prove anything. He was simply a man walking through a familiar absurdity, as if he'd navigated such nonsense 100 times before. His name was Marcus Ellison, and his wrists were bound by cold steel handcuffs. Most of the faces in the courtroom, from the weary clerk to the bored bailiff, didn't recognize him. To them, he was merely another black man with a record, another figure who had, presumably, acted out and was now due to answer for it. Near the back, 2 deputies, young men who looked fresh out of the academy, their uniforms stiff and new, exchanged knowing glances. A quiet chuckle escaped one. "Look at this one," he muttered, nudging his partner with an elbow, a sneer playing on his lips. "Thinks he's on Wall Street or something." The other leaned in, a smirk mirroring his colleague's. "Yeah, probably read half a law book in jail and now thinks he's slick." Neither of them, in their casual, dismissive contempt, seemed to notice the way Marcus's eyes subtly scanned the room. There was no fear in that gaze, no confusion, only an alert, practiced watchfulness. It was as if he had been here before, as if he already intimately understood the unspoken rules of this place, the assumptions that hung heavy in the stale air. He was brought before Judge Ronald Beck, a white man in his early 60s whose weary eyes typically avoided direct contact with defendants unless they were already deemed worthy of his respect. Today was no exception. The judge barely glanced up as Marcus stood before him. "Defendant is charged with obstruction of justice," the clerk droned, her voice flat. "Incident involved non-compliance during a lawful traffic stop and verbal interference with an officer's duties." The courtroom was silent, the very air stiff with unspoken judgment. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze still fixed on the paperwork before him. "Mr. Ellison, do you have legal counsel present?" Marcus's voice, when it came, was unnervingly calm, steady, cutting through the silence with an unexpected authority. "I'd like to waive that right and speak for myself, Your Honor." A low murmur rippled through the room, a collective ripple of surprise. People shifted in their seats, their curiosity momentarily piqued. The deputies in the back scoffed again, their disdain amplified by their certainty. Finally, Judge Beck looked up for the first time, his gaze finally settling on Marcus, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You sure about that? These are serious charges." "Yes, Your Honor. I'm aware." Marcus's response was quiet, unwavering. The judge shrugged, a dismissive gesture that conveyed his low expectations. "All right. You'll get your chance. But first, let's hear what the prosecution has to say." That's when the assistant district attorney, Rebecca Tinsley, stood. Young, ambitious, and clearly prepared to make quick, efficient work of what she undoubtedly considered an open and shut case, she launched into her opening statement. She described Marcus as combative, claimed he refused to exit his vehicle during a routine stop, asserted he was aggressive in tone, and attempted to direct officers on how to perform their duties. She even suggested that the officers feared for their safety because of how he escalated the situation with unnecessary questioning. Throughout it all, Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt, didn't twitch, didn't even blink. He stood perfectly still, like a man listening to a fantastical fairy tale, a narrative spun by someone utterly disconnected from the truth. But beneath the surface, a subtle unease began to stir among those truly observing. Something wasn't adding up. The details were too clean, too rehearsed, too neatly tailored. The whole courtroom, against its will, found itself staring at this well-dressed man in handcuffs, silently wondering how his composed image could possibly fit the charges being leveled against him. One of the deputies, Officer Harmon, whispered again, no longer so quietly, "Hope he remembers how that suit looked when his back in orange." And that's when Marcus, with a precision that belied his calm, turned his head just slightly. He looked directly at them. Not for long, just long enough. Long enough to make them shut up, their smirks instantly vanishing, replaced by a sudden, chilling flicker of discomfort. But the real story, the true unraveling, hadn't even begun. The hallway outside the courtroom wasn't much quieter than the hushed tension within. A few officers leaned against the humming vending machines, casually swapping stories about the combative suit guy, their laughter still laced with condescension. Others hovered near the glass doors, shaking their heads with a practiced weariness, as if they'd seen this particular act of defiant arrogance play out 1,000 times before. Inside, however, a profound shift had begun. Marcus sat at the defense table, his hands now freed from the cold steel but resting with an almost unnatural stillness, as if they belonged to someone far removed from the petty charges he faced. His posture was one of quiet confidence, not cocky, not performative, but deeply, intrinsically sure. The two arresting deputies, Officer Troy Keegan and Officer Blake Harmon, were now seated closer to the front, their expressions a little too smug for men sworn to impartiality. The courtroom bailiff, a burly figure, walked over and leaned in, his voice a low murmur. "You two arrested him, right?" "Yeah," Keegan drawled, chewing gum with an exaggerated, almost theatrical performance. Didn't even raise his voice. Just kept asking us for badge numbers and department policy. Real cute. One of those know your rights guys. Harmon chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Yeah, he kept saying stuff like, 'I'll be filing this,' and 'you're out of line.' Like he knew something we didn't." The bailiff joined their mirth. "I've seen that type. They always fold when the charges stick." Unseen by them, across the gallery, sat a black woman, perhaps in her late 40s. Denise Hall. She had slipped in quietly, taking a seat alone, her hair tied back, phone off, her eyes fixed on Marcus. She hadn't looked away once since he'd entered, a silent, unwavering sentinel. The DA, Rebecca Tinsley, wrapped up her opening statement with a flourish, her voice ringing with confident righteousness. She pointed to the so-called body cam footage, which she smoothly explained had unfortunately suffered technical issues during part of the stop, a convenient blurring of the truth. She emphasized the officer's professionalism despite Marcus's alleged verbal antagonism, a classic, well-rehearsed narrative. Then, it was Marcus's turn. He stood slowly, deliberately, a subtle adjustment of his jacket the only outward sign of movement. He walked up to the front, not like a defendant bracing for battle, but like a professor about to deliver a lecture, his calm commanding the room's attention. "I want to begin," he said, his voice clear, resonant, and devoid of any tremor, "by reminding the court that traffic stops don't give officers the right to ignore procedure, to misrepresent facts, or to escalate unnecessarily." Judge Beck shifted in his seat, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. "Mr. Ellison, keep it specific to your case." "I am." Marcus's gaze drifted past the judge, past the DA, settling directly on the gallery, right past the smirking deputies. "I was pulled over on Route 141 at approximately 6:13 p.m. I asked the officers why I was being stopped. I was told my taillight was a little dim. Not broken. Not out. Just dim." He let that detail hang in the air for a moment, a tiny, seemingly innocuous discrepancy. I then asked for clarification, calmly, on what the officer meant. I asked if I was being detained or if I was free to go. I asked for badge numbers. I informed them I was recording. Keegan snorted audibly from his seat, but Marcus didn't break pace, his eyes unblinking. "They asked me to exit the vehicle. I asked what law required me to do that, given the reason for the stop. I told them I wasn't refusing, I just wanted clarification." The judge held up a hand, a gesture of mild warning, but Marcus had already taken a deep breath, steeling himself for the next, more visceral part of his story. "Then I was pulled from my car. pushed against the hood. My phone was knocked to the ground. One of them, I won't say which yet, told me to stop acting smart and just take the ticket like a man. That silenced the room. You could feel the tension shift, palpable and electric. The soft chuckling from the deputies stopped abruptly, their smirks replaced by rigid, uneasy expressions. Even the judge leaned back a little, just enough to show he was beginning to pay real, undivided attention. I didn't resist, Marcus continued, his voice calm, unwavering, each word a hammer blow of truth. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten anyone. But somehow, I ended up in handcuffs, facing charges, standing in front of you today. He looked directly at the DA, Rebecca. I've reviewed the incident report. I've seen how the language was shaped to justify the arrest. Words like non-compliant and verbal interference don't reflect what really happened. The courtroom was holding its breath, a collective gasp suspended in the air. Marcus returned to his seat, quiet again, his presence a still point in the suddenly charged atmosphere. Officer Keegan leaned to Harmon, whispering, "Man's got a script too. Too bad it won't save him." And just then, as if on cue, Denise stood up in the gallery. She reached into her purse, slowly and deliberately, and held up a sealed white envelope. She handed it to the bailiff without a word, her gaze firm, then sat back down. But that envelope, small and unassuming, contained a truth that would change everything. The small, sealed white envelope sat on the judge's bench, an unassuming object that held the power to shatter the carefully constructed reality of the courtroom. Judge Beck narrowed his eyes at it, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face, as if it might explode. He waved the bailiff over, who brought it to the bench with a swift, almost reverent movement. "What is this?" the judge asked, his voice sharp with a hint of impatience. The bailiff glanced down, then back up at the judge. "It's addressed to the court, Your Honor. Signed by the Department of Justice." That got heads turning, a ripple of surprised murmurs spreading through the gallery. Even the stoic stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. The judge, his curiosity now fully piqued, carefully opened the envelope, pulling out a typed letter bearing an official watermark. He began to read silently, his eyebrows twitching, then his lips moved almost imperceptibly, as if he were reading it again to ensure he wasn't misinterpreting its gravity. The silence in the room stretched, thick and pregnant with anticipation. Finally, he cleared his throat, the sound unusually loud in the quiet, and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Ellison, do you want to explain this?" Marcus stood again, slowly, deliberately, his composure unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. That letter contains a copy of a sealed authorization issued to me 3 weeks ago by the Department of Justice. It confirms that I was operating under directive as part of an internal investigation." A tangible stir went through the courtroom, hushed whispers erupting like a sudden breeze. Marcus continued, his voice calm, clear, and utterly commanding. "I've recently been appointed Deputy Director of Internal Affairs at the FBI. I was conducting a covert field review of routine traffic stops in the region, following a spike in civilian complaints, particularly from marginalized communities." The room went dead silent. No smirks, no whispers. Just open mouths and shifting chairs. The two deputies, Officer Keegan and Officer Harmon, looked as if they'd swallowed a battery. Keegan's face went from pale to ashen, his jaw dropping. His partner, Harmon, blinked rapidly, almost violently, as if trying to reverse time by sheer willpower, willing away the last few damning moments. Marcus looked directly at the judge, his gaze steady, devoid of triumph, yet radiating an undeniable authority. "I wasn't just pulled over. I was targeted. I asked questions officers are trained to expect. I followed every protocol, and I documented every second of it." The judge still hadn't blinked, his face a mask of stunned realization. "Is there video?" he finally managed, his voice strained. "There's backup footage from my personal device," Marcus replied, his voice calm, unwavering. "It was synced to cloud storage. That recording is now in federal custody. There is also surveillance footage from a business nearby. You'll find it matches every word I've spoken here." The DA, Rebecca Tinsley, finally broke her stunned silence, her polished composure crumbling. "Your Honor, I I was not informed of any federal involvement in this matter. You weren't supposed to be, Marcus stated simply, his gaze now turning to her, cool and direct. The purpose was to observe unfiltered behavior, not filtered responses to a badge. Judge Beck was quiet for a long second, processing the earth-shattering implications. And the arrest report? He finally asked, his voice low. Fabricated, Marcus replied, without hesitation, or at best, creatively written. In the back row, Denise, who had worked at the DOJ for almost 20 years and had been the one to suggest Jefferson County for the audit, nodded slightly, a flicker of grim satisfaction in her eyes. The judge turned to the DA, his voice now sharper, imbued with a newfound authority. Miss Tinsley, I want to see the footage. All of it. I want to know exactly how a federal agent operating under DOJ directive ended up facing criminal charges in my courtroom. Rebecca stammered. Yes, Your Honor, I'll retrieve everything immediately. The judge then turned toward the officers, Keegan and Harmon, who slowly, rigidly rose from their seats, their faces drained of all color, their previous smugness utterly vanished. The entire room watched them, mesmerized, as they walked forward, like men heading toward a guillotine. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I don't care if you thought he was just another suspect, he stated, his voice low but cutting. I care that your report now looks compromised. I care that your behavior in this courtroom, in front of me, in front of this man who was doing his job, tells me more about your judgment than any paperwork. Keegan opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him instantly. Save it. You'll be speaking to Internal Affairs now. Not me. Marcus returned to his seat without a word. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile, he didn't offer a single triumphant glance. He just looked over at the two officers, then calmly looked away. Rebecca, still reeling, turned back toward him. Mr. Ellison, It's done, he said quietly, his voice a balm on the suddenly volatile air. The tape will speak for itself. He wasn't there for revenge. That was never the assignment. But Denise, watching from the back row, now had tears in her eyes. She knew what it had taken to even get someone like Marcus inside that courtroom undercover. She knew how dangerous it was, how easily it could have gone catastrophically wrong. And it almost had. But the court hadn't seen the footage yet, and some people, lost in their own ingrained biases, still weren't ready to believe what it truly showed. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with an unprecedented energy. Local news crews, having caught wind of the mystery defendant and the rapidly circulating whispers about Marcus Ellison's true identity, had descended upon Jefferson County. The speculation had grown into a roar overnight. Officer Keegan and Officer Harmon, their faces etched with a new, grim reality, sat alone at the back, their usual easy confidence evaporated. There was no more whispering, no more chewing gum, just profound silence and tightly clenched jaws. Judge Beck entered 5 minutes late, an unusual breach of his strict punctuality. He looked tense, but there was a new alertness in his eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. As soon as he sat, he cut straight to the point, his voice grave. We've reviewed the footage submitted by the Department of Justice. We've compared it to the arrest report and statements made by the officers involved. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, then settling directly on Marcus. What we saw, he said slowly, each word deliberate and heavy with revelation, was a man conducting himself with composure, asking legitimate procedural questions, making no physical threats, offering no resistance, and being treated with increasing hostility until he was forcibly removed from his vehicle. You could have heard a pin drop. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Judge Beck then turned to the prosecution. Miss Tinsley. Rebecca stood, looking markedly less polished than yesterday, her blouse a little wrinkled, her eyes puffy with sleeplessness. Your Honor, she stammered, her voice thin. I want to formally withdraw the charges against Mr. Ellison. And I will be filing a motion to review the original report submitted by the arresting officers. The judge nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. Good. Because as it stands, there is a serious discrepancy between reality and what those officers put to paper. Marcus didn't react, not even a blink, but from the back, Denise let out a small, almost inaudible breath of relief, a tension she hadn't realized she was holding finally released. Then, the judge looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Ellison, I'd like to apologize on behalf of this court." Marcus tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the unprecedented gesture, but said nothing. His calm was unwavering. "I've been doing this job a long time," the judge went on, his voice laced with a raw honesty that surprised everyone. "And somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting people like you to show up here with the truth already in your corner. That's on me." Still, Marcus offered no reply. Because that wasn't the point of any of this. The judge turned back to the room, his gaze now firm, uncompromising. "As for the officers involved, their conduct will be reviewed by federal investigators, effective immediately. This courtroom will no longer be handling this matter. It is now in the hands of the DOJ." Gasps and murmurs filled the gallery, a ripple of shock and vindication. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens flying across notebooks. A local deputy leaning by the door took 2 steps backward, then instinctively stepped outside. Then, out of nowhere, Officer Harmon stood up, a figure of sudden, unexpected vulnerability. "I want to say something." The judge raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise in his expression. "This isn't your time to testify." "I know," Harmon said, his voice cracking slightly, the bravado completely gone. "But I need to say it anyway." Judge Beck, sensing a moment of genuine, albeit forced, introspection, didn't stop him. "I thought I was just doing my job," Harmon began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if someone asked too many questions, they were stalling or trying to bait us. I didn't think." He glanced at Marcus, a flicker of something akin to shame in his eyes. "I didn't think someone like him could really be watching us for a reason. I didn't think about why he kept asking for badge numbers. I just saw someone who made me uncomfortable and assumed that meant he was a problem." Marcus didn't move. He didn't offer a hand, didn't offer a word of comfort or triumph. He didn't need to. The message had already landed, resounding through the room. It wasn't about Marcus being FBI. It was about how quickly people made assumptions, how easily bias could cloud judgment, and how devastatingly dangerous those assumptions could be. Judge Beck finally looked toward Marcus again, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You're free to go." Marcus nodded once, calm as ever, no grin, no glare. He walked out of that courtroom the same way he walked in, straight-backed, eyes forward, utterly unbothered by the noise and whispers that now erupted behind him. But the headlines that came after, those were anything but quiet. By noon, the story had made national news. "Man in courtroom shocked officers, turns out his FBI director." Jefferson County officers under investigation for profiling high-ranking federal agent. FBI deputy director mistaken for suspect during routine stop. Social media devoured it. Memes, hashtags, heated debates on every platform. Some people were shocked, some were angry, and others, with a grim knowing, simply said, "This is exactly why we don't trust the system." While the nation buzzed with the scandal, Marcus Ellison himself was far from the spotlight. He was back at his temporary office in St. Louis, a starkly humble space with nothing but a small desk, a legal pad, and a steaming black coffee. He wasn't watching the news. He didn't need to. The internal tremors of change had already begun. Denise walked in, her face holding a quiet resolve, and placed a thick manila folder on his desk. "That's everything from their department," she stated, her voice low. "Internal complaints filed or ignored for the last 2 years." Marcus flipped it open, the pages thick with suppressed grievances. "Same names come up too often," she added, a grim assessment. "But this one's bigger than those 2 deputies." Marcus nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible confirmation. "Always is." She hesitated at the door, a question in her eyes. "You think they'll keep their badges?" Marcus looked up, his gaze steady. "Probably not. But I'm not after their jobs. I'm after their patterns." That night, Marcus met with his supervisor, Director Samuel Granger, an older man from D.C. who had flown in just to talk in person. Granger, with 40 years in law enforcement, was the kind of man who saw through nonsense before it had time to fully form. "You handled that better than I would have," Granger conceded, leaning back in the worn leather chair, a rare compliment from the veteran. You could have embarrassed the whole department in front of the media. You didn't. Marcus gave a small shrug. Wasn't the point. Granger took a sip of water, his eyes fixed on Marcus. You know how this ends, right? They'll focus on the surprise, the title, the fact that you were FBI the whole time. They'll miss the reason you were even pulled over in the first place. Marcus offered a faint, knowing half-smile. Then we remind them. Granger smiled too, a genuine, rare display of approval. That's why I put you in this seat. He reached into his bag and handed Marcus another file. This one's yours. Next location's in Indiana. Bigger department, more layers. You ready? Marcus looked at the folder, then back up at his supervisor, his eyes holding a quiet, unwavering readiness. I've been ready. Meanwhile, back in Jefferson County, things were falling apart faster than anyone had anticipated. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation. Several officers were immediately suspended pending review. Civilian complaints that had been conveniently lost for years started reappearing, surfacing from the depths of ignored files. One officer resigned before the week was out, seeking to escape the inevitable. Another lawyered up, preparing for a protracted battle. As for Keegan and Harmon, they had separate interviews with DOJ investigators. Their uniforms gone, their badges confiscated. There were only empty hands and hollow excuses that sounded thinner with every nervous repetition. But the real damage wasn't just to their careers, it was to their image. That self-satisfied smirk they wore in the courtroom, so confidently displayed, was gone, replaced by the quiet, dawning understanding that they were no longer untouchable. And the community. They weren't staying silent anymore. A local pastor held a town hall meeting that weekend. Dozens came, some with fresh stories of their own mistreatment, others with phones full of videos. None of them were surprised by what had happened to Marcus, only by the fact that, for once, someone powerful was actually watching. A woman stood up during that meeting, her voice trembling but strong, filled with a raw, undeniable pain. My son was arrested last year for resisting, just like that man, except he wasn't FBI. He didn't have a camera. He didn't get his day in court like that. A heavy silence fell, then a man in the back stood, his voice ringing with newfound hope, but maybe now someone's listening. And that, truly, was the part nobody had seen coming. 1 week later, Jefferson County looked different. The sheriff held a press conference, speaking all the right words: integrity, accountability, disappointment. But his voice cracked just slightly when he said, "We are cooperating fully with federal authorities." Because he knew, everyone knew, this wasn't just about two rogue officers. This was about a department and a culture that had been coasting unchecked for years. In a small diner off Highway 30, the same deputies who had once laughed in court now sat in a back booth, their heads low, their uniforms replaced by sweatshirts and ball caps. A couple of regulars stared at them, but didn't speak. Keegan stirred his coffee, though he didn't drink it. "You think we'll do time?" he muttered. Harmon shook his head. "No. But we won't get back on the force. Not here. Maybe not anywhere." They both stared out the window, their futures a vast, uncertain landscape. "I didn't know who he was," Keegan muttered again, the phrase a self-pitying lament. Harmon rubbed his face, the bitter truth dawning. "That's the problem, man. You only care now 'cause you found out who he was." Across town, Denise stood outside a bustling community center with Marcus. A group of young volunteers had invited him to speak, not as the FBI guy, but simply as a black man who had walked through a fire and refused to burn. He didn't say much. He didn't give a lecture or rattle off credentials. He simply told a story. He told them what it felt like to be handcuffed for asking questions, what it felt like to be calm, to be right, and still be treated like a threat. He didn't yell, he didn't cry. He just laid it out flat. And when one teenage boy raised his hand and asked, "How do you not get mad?" Marcus looked him dead in the eye and said, "Oh, I get mad. I just use it. I don't let it use me." The room was quiet after that. Nobody blinked. Even the adults in the back were listening, truly listening. Later, Denise walked him to his car. You think it'll change anything? She asked, a hint of weary skepticism in her voice. Marcus opened the car door, glancing back at the community center, where the lights still shone. Maybe not everything, but it changed something. And that's how it starts. She nodded, then hesitated. You sure you want to keep doing this undercover stuff? You've got a seat at the top now. He smiled, but not the happy kind. It was a knowing, tired smile. That seat never changed anything from the top. It only looks powerful if you don't know what real power is. He got in the car and drove off. Not to DC, not to some press junket, but to the next case. The next quiet town. The next traffic stop where someone thought a badge gave them the right to twist the rules. The next place where someone needed to be reminded that not every black man pulled over is defenseless. Some are watching, and some have the power to act. Meanwhile, back in Jefferson County, Judge Beck had begun reviewing old cases. Ones he barely remembered, ones that now looked disturbingly different now that the curtain had been pulled back. He pulled one file, then another, recognizing the same officers, the same vague, incriminating language. He set them aside for review. For once, he was looking past the ink, past the surface. Because once you've seen the truth, pretending it never happened, that's no longer an option. 3 months later, the courtroom still looked the same, but people saw it differently now. The county had a new oversight committee, civilian-led, with monthly reviews. Officers were now required to attend, not just to listen, but to speak, to answer, to be present. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. Officer Keegan now worked private security at a shipping warehouse outside of St. Louis. No badge, no gun, just a clipboard and a radio. He didn't talk much, and people didn't ask. Harmon moved out of state, tried to start over, but the name was out there now, a shadow that followed him. Every interview asked about the Marcus Ellison incident, and he stopped applying after the 5th one. As for Judge Beck, he started showing up to community events, not because he wanted to be seen, but because he realized he hadn't truly been seeing. He'd stopped assuming. He started reading cases differently, slower, with more weight. Some people still said Marcus embarrassed the department. Others said he exposed it. But the people who understood, they said he did what needed to be done. And Marcus? He didn't stay in the spotlight, didn't try to book, didn't go on a speaking tour. He stayed quiet, moved in silence, kept going. Because there were other towns, other departments, other people getting dismissed for speaking up, getting punished for asking the right questions the wrong way. You know the kind. There's a lesson buried in what happened, not just about race, not just about power, but about assumption. About how fast people decide who you are before you say a single word. About how easy it is to ignore a man's truth when you think you already know his story. Marcus never needed the room to like him. He needed them to listen. And when they finally did, not because of his badge, but because of his evidence, his calm, his undeniable facts, the room changed. Because they didn't see him anymore as just a black man in a suit. They saw the devastating gap between what they believed and what was real. And when that happens, that's where change truly starts.